Something strange happened 30 years ago at an amusement park. A mother and her little daughter got on a roller coaster and never came back. No one saw them leave. No bodies, no explanations, just an unsolvable mystery that left a man completely shattered. Now, 3 decades later, that same man, now old and hopeless, walks into a church and sees something impossible. A young woman, standing at the altar, looking exactly like his lost daughter. But the moment he tries to speak, a cold hand grips his arm, and a voice whispers, "Leave now. You don't belong here." What secret has been buried for 30 years? What truly happened that day on the roller coaster? Stay until the end of this story, because nothing is what it seems. And before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Thomas Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the small wooden box on the table in front of him. His hands trembled as he traced the edges of the old envelope resting beside it. He had received it that morning, tucked under his door with no sender, no stamp, no indication of how it had gotten there. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried something far greater than just paper and ink. He hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. 30 years. That's how long it had been since his world had collapsed. Since he had lost Claire and Emily. Since he had stopped living and merely existed in the shadow of his past. But today, for the first time in decades, something pulled at him. A whisper of a possibility, as impossible as it seemed. Taking a deep breath, he tore the envelope open. Inside was a single photograph. A young woman, her hair golden, her smile warm, her features heartbreakingly familiar. Thomas gasped, his vision blurring as he brought the photo closer. It was Emily. It had to be, but that was impossible. His daughter had been 7 years old when she disappeared on that cursed roller coaster. If she had survived, she would be 37 now. This woman looked no older than 25. His fingers shook as he turned the photo over. 3 words were scrawled on the back in messy, hurried handwriting. "She is alive." His breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed that it couldn't be real. A cruel trick. A mistake. A delusion. But his heart dared to hope. He read the second line beneath it. "Come to St. Joseph's Church." The name sent a chill through his bones. He knew that church. It was on the other side of town. An old, looming structure that had stood for over a century. He had no reason to go there before, but now he had no choice. He grabbed his coat, ignoring the pain in his knees as he stood. He had been growing weaker over the years, his body failing him in ways he never used to notice. But none of it mattered now. He had to see for himself. The bus ride was long, the city passing in a blur. He barely noticed the people around him, barely heard the sounds of laughter, conversation, life moving on without him. His hands remained clenched around the photograph, as if it might disappear if he let go. When he arrived, the church was already full. People dressed in elegant clothing murmured excitedly, their voices bouncing off the high ceilings. A wedding. Thomas's heart pounded harder as he made his way inside, trying to stay unseen, unnoticed. He didn't belong here, but someone was pulling him forward. And then he saw her. Standing at the altar, draped in white, was the woman from the photograph. She was breathtaking, her long golden hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes bright yet distant, as if she were in a world of her own. She turned slightly, and Thomas's entire being froze. The shape of her face, the curve of her lips, the softness in her eyes. It was her. It had to be. Emily. His hands gripped the pew in front of him, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He wanted to call out, to scream her name, but his voice was trapped in his throat. And then, just as he took a shaky step forward, a firm hand clamped down on his arm. "Leave. Now." Thomas turned sharply, his gaze meeting that of a man in a dark suit, his expression cold, unmoving. "You don't belong here," the man continued in a whisper. Thomas's heart raced. "Who is she?" he rasped. Who is the bride?" The man's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have come." And then, before Thomas could react, another voice called out from the altar. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" Thomas watched in horror as the young woman hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly. She looked down at the frail, elderly groom in a wheelchair beside her, his face sunken with age, his eyes half-lidded yet aware. And then she spoke. I do. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. His breath came in sharp gasps, his vision blurring. The hand on his arm tightened. Walk away. But Thomas couldn't. He wouldn't. He had already lost her once. He wouldn't lose her again. And then, as if sensing his presence, the young woman's gaze lifted. Her eyes met his. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Recognition? Confusion? Fear? And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. She turned away, her hands tightening around the frail man's. The ceremony continued, but Thomas was already moving, pushing past the crowd, his breathing uneven. He barely noticed the whispers following him, barely noticed the growing sense of dread in his gut. He had to know the truth. He stumbled out of the church, gasping for air. The world around him felt surreal, distant. His pulse pounded in his ears. The photograph in his pocket burned against his skin. And then he heard a voice, low, almost imperceptible. She doesn't remember. Thomas spun around. An elderly woman stood near the entrance of the church, her wrinkled hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. What did you say? He demanded, stepping closer. The woman sighed, shaking her head. She doesn't remember who she is. And she can't. Not yet. Thomas's mind reeled. Who are you? How do you know this? But the woman simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows before he could get another word out. Thomas stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Emily, his Emily. She was alive, but she didn't remember, and someone didn't want her to. As the weight of it all crashed down on him, a single realization took hold. He had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost him. Thomas Carter couldn't breathe. His heart pounded violently against his ribcage as he stood frozen outside the church, his thoughts colliding like waves in a storm. The woman at the altar, it had been her. He knew it in his bones. He had spent decades memorizing his daughter's face, aching over every detail lost with time. But now she stood before him, alive, real, yet completely unaware of who she truly was. The world around him blurred as the weight of it all pressed down on his frail body. She didn't remember. She couldn't remember. And someone wanted to keep it that way. The old woman's words echoed in his ears. She doesn't remember, and she can't. Not yet. Not yet. Thomas turned sharply, scanning the street, searching for the woman who had just whispered the most cryptic words he had ever heard. But she was gone, vanished into the night as if she had never been there. His hands clenched at his sides, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He needed answers. He needed to see her, speak to her, hold her face in his hands and demand to know if any part of her remembered the father who had never stopped grieving for her. But how? The ceremony was over. The guests were spilling out of the church now, laughter and hushed conversations filling the air as the newlyweds made their way to a sleek black car waiting by the curb. Thomas's gaze locked onto the bride, onto her. She was holding onto the elderly groom's hand, her fingers curled delicately around his, her expression unreadable. She didn't look happy. She didn't look sad. She looked vacant. And then, just as she was about to step into the car, she glanced over her shoulder. For a fraction of a second, her gaze met his. Thomas held his breath. There it was again, that flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition? Doubt? A shadow of a memory struggling to surface? He took a step forward, opening his mouth to call out. But before he could make a sound, the man in the dark suit, the same one who had grabbed him inside the church, appeared at his side. Don't, the man murmured. Thomas flinched at the warning in his voice. You need to let this go, the man continued, his tone calm, controlled, but laced with something darker beneath it. For your own good. Thomas clenched his jaw. Who are you? The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Walk away. Thomas's hands curled into fists. That's my daughter. The man's expression didn't change. No, it's not. Thomas's breath hitched. Emily Carter died 30 years ago, the man said simply. Let the past stay buried. A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. His blood turned to ice. And then, without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Thomas standing there, fists clenched, heart pounding, mind reeling. Let the past stay buried. But how could he? His daughter was alive, and someone had spent the last 30 years making sure he never found her. Thomas didn't go home that night. He wandered the city aimlessly, lost in thought, lost in grief, lost in the suffocating weight of everything he had just seen. He found himself at a small cafe just before dawn, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His hands trembled as he held the photograph that had arrived in the mysterious envelope, his eyes scanning every detail of the woman in the picture. It had to be Emily. It had to be. But if it was, then why? Why didn't she remember? Who had taken her? Where had she been all these years? And why was she marrying a man old enough to be her grandfather? The questions clawed at him, relentless and cruel. He had spent 3 decades living in grief, believing his wife and daughter had perished in that unspeakable tragedy. And now everything had changed. He needed answers, and there was only one place he could start: St. Joseph's Church. The church was nearly empty when he arrived later that morning. The wedding decorations had been taken down, leaving behind only the lingering scent of candles and roses. Thomas made his way down the aisle, his fingers trailing over the wooden pews as memories of the night before played in his mind. He reached the altar and stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where she had stood. "Can I help you?" Thomas turned. A priest stood near the entrance of the sacristy, his gaze wary but not unkind. He was an older man, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too many secrets. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "The woman who got married here last night. Do you know her?" The priest's expression didn't change. "Many weddings happen here." Thomas took a slow breath. "Her name? What's her name?" A beat of silence. "Elizabeth." Thomas's heart clenched. "Not Emily. Elizabeth." The priest's eyes softened slightly as he took a step closer. "You were here last night, weren't you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The priest exhaled, as if weighing something heavy in his mind. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly, "I know why you're here." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The priest looked around, as if making sure they were alone. Then he motioned for Thomas to follow him. They walked through the empty hallways of the church, the air thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. The priest led him to a small room tucked away near the back, a simple space with old bookshelves and a single wooden desk. He gestured for Thomas to sit. The silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the priest spoke. "She doesn't know," he said simply. "She doesn't remember anything before the age of 7. Thomas's breath caught. The priest continued, his voice low. "She was found 30 years ago, alone. No memories, no past, just a child wandering in the dark." He met Thomas's gaze. "She was adopted into a family who raised her as Elizabeth. They never told her the truth." Thomas's fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. "Why?" His voice was barely a whisper. The priest's expression darkened. "Because some truths are too dangerous to remember." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. The priest stiffened. His face paled slightly as he rose to his feet. "Go," he whispered urgently. Thomas frowned. "What? Go now, before they know you were here." A chill ran through Thomas's spine. The knock came again, harder this time. The priest turned to him one last time, his expression grave. "Whatever you do, don't let them take her again." Thomas's blood ran cold. And then, before he could say another word, the priest opened the door, revealing a man in a dark suit standing on the other side. The same man from the church the night before. Thomas didn't wait. He turned and fled. And as he ran through the empty hallways of the church, his heart pounding, his mind racing, only one thought remained. Someone had stolen his daughter, and they weren't finished yet. Thomas Carter didn't stop running. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stumbled out of the church, his body protesting with every step. His knees ached, his chest burned, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was closer than he had ever been. Not when he had just heard the one thing that confirmed everything he had feared. They had taken her. Emily Elizabeth, his daughter. They had erased her past, stripped her of her memories, and molded her into someone else. And now, after 30 years, someone was still trying to keep him from finding her. The city was cold that morning, a mist settling over the streets as he moved quickly, turning corners, disappearing into alleyways. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that if he did, he would see them. The man in the dark suit, the shadow lingering at the edge of his vision, the people who had spent decades keeping Emily away from him. He needed time. He needed answers. And there was only one place left to go. The bus ride back to his apartment was agonizingly slow. His hands clenched into fists as the priest's words echoed in his mind. She doesn't know. She doesn't remember anything before the age of 7. She was found alone. No past. No memories. They never told her the truth. His stomach twisted. Who were they? Who had found her? And why had they erased her life? His fingers dug into the worn leather of the bus seat. Whoever they were, they hadn't just taken Emily. They had taken Claire too. His wife, the love of his life, the mother of his child. She had disappeared that same night. But while he had spent years mourning her, searching for her, questioning if she had died alongside their daughter, now he wasn't sure. Had she been taken too? Had she known the truth? And if she had she spent the last 30 years trying to get their daughter back? The thought sent a sharp, painful jolt through him. Because if Claire had been alive all this time, if she had been out there, fighting in the shadows for Emily, then why hadn't she come back to him? Unless she couldn't. Unless someone had stopped her. The bus jerked to a stop, and Thomas forced himself to stand. His body protested, his legs weak beneath him, but he pushed forward. He had spent too many years trapped in grief, too many years believing he had lost everything. But now he had a chance. He had a daughter to save. His apartment was exactly as he had left it. Small, cluttered, the air thick with the weight of too many memories. He locked the door behind him, pressing his back against it for a moment before exhaling sharply. Then, with trembling hands, he moved toward the old wooden box sitting on his coffee table. It was the only thing he had left of Claire, the only thing he had never been able to bring himself to open. His fingers hovered over the lid. He had told himself that whatever was inside didn't matter, that it wouldn't change the past. But now, after everything, after seeing Emily Elizabeth, standing at that altar, after hearing the priest's warning, he knew the past wasn't gone. It had just been buried, and it was time to dig it back up. His breath hitched as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled beneath old letters and faded photographs, was something he hadn't seen in 30 years. Claire's journal. His hands shook as he pulled it out, the leather worn and soft beneath his fingers. The pages were yellowed with time. The ink faded in places, but her handwriting was still there, still hers. He flipped to the last entry, and his blood ran cold. If something happens to me, if I disappear, please, don't believe what they tell you. Don't stop searching. Don't stop fighting. They took Emily. They'll come for me next. But I won't stop. I won't let them win. I will find our daughter. Thomas's vision blurred. If you ever find this, if you ever see these words, it means I failed. It means they won. And it means you have to keep going. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Follow the butterfly. His eyes snapped to the last words scrawled on the page. The ink was darker, as if she had pressed the pen down harder. Follow the butterfly. His fingers curled around the edge of the journal. A butterfly. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. Emily's necklace. She had worn it every day. A small silver butterfly on a delicate chain. A gift from Claire on her 5th birthday. It had been around her neck the day she vanished. And now, 30 years later, Thomas had seen that same necklace. On Elizabeth, a cold wave of realization washed over him. She still had it. Somewhere, buried deep in her subconscious, a part of her still held onto that piece of her past. Piece of him, piece of Claire. And that meant there was still hope. His hands tightened around the journal. He needed to see her. He needed to speak to her. And this time, no one was going to stop him. The house was massive. Thomas stood outside the iron gates, his breath fogging in the cold evening air. It was the kind of home that reeked of wealth, of power, of control. It was the kind of place where secrets were buried. And inside, somewhere behind those high walls and perfect windows, was his daughter. A black car sat in the driveway, its sleek frame gleaming beneath the streetlights. He recognized it instantly. The man from the church. Thomas's jaw clenched. He knew he couldn't just walk through the front door. He needed another way in, another way to reach her. His gaze flickered to the side of the house, to the narrow path that led to the back. Without a second thought, he moved. His body ached with every step, his muscles protesting, but he ignored it. He had spent 30 years waiting for this moment. He wasn't about to stop now. The garden was silent. Thomas moved carefully, his breath shallow, his steps light. He kept to the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest as he made his way toward the house. And then, a light flickered on. A silhouette appeared in the window. His breath caught. Elizabeth. She stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze distant. She looked lost, trapped. Thomas's throat tightened. Then, before he could stop himself, before he could think about what he was doing, he lifted his hand and knocked softly against the glass. She froze. Her head turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a long, heart-stopping moment, she didn't move. And then, a flicker of something crossed her face. A memory, a whisper of recognition. Thomas's heart pounded. And then she did the last thing he expected. She reached up and touched the butterfly necklace around her neck. Thomas exhaled shakily. There she was, his Emily, buried beneath 30 years of lies. And this time he wasn't letting her go. Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. His breath was trapped in his chest, his heart pounding against his ribs as he stood frozen outside the window, his gaze locked onto hers. Elizabeth, Emily, his daughter. She was right there, inches away, staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Her fingers curled around the delicate silver butterfly that hung from her neck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, she took a step closer to the window. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say something, wanted to call her name, wanted to reach through the glass and pull her into his arms and never let go. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. She was confused. He could see it in the way her brow furrowed, in the way she hesitated, as if part of her recognized him but couldn't place how or why. And then, a shadow moved behind her. Thomas's entire body tensed. Someone else was in the room. Elizabeth stiffened, her expression changing in an instant. The moment of recognition vanished, replaced by something else. Fear. Thomas's pulse skyrocketed. She turned sharply, her hand falling away from the necklace as a voice filled the room behind her. Low, controlled, familiar. The man from the church. Thomas clenched his fists at his sides, his entire body rigid as Elizabeth took another step away from the window, her posture stiff, obedient. He watched in helpless agony as she turned to face the man in the dark suit, nodding silently at whatever he was saying. Then, without looking back, she walked away. Thomas pressed a hand against the glass, his heart hammering. No. She had seen him. She had felt something. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she had remembered. But someone was keeping her from the truth. Someone was controlling her, shaping her reality, making her believe that she was Elizabeth, someone she was never meant to be. Thomas exhaled sharply, stepping back from the window. His mind was racing, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had to get to her. He had to find a way inside. and he had to do it before it was too late. The night was long. Thomas returned to his apartment, his head pounding, his body exhausted but his mind restless. He paced the floor, gripping Claire's journal in one hand, the photograph of Emily, Elizabeth, in the other. He had come so close. He had seen her. She had seen him. And now she was slipping away again. He sank into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed a plan. He needed to find out who the man in the suit was, what he wanted, why he was keeping Emily trapped in a life that wasn't hers. He needed to find out what had happened that day 30 years ago, when everything had been taken from him. His eyes drifted back to the journal, to the last words Claire had written. Follow the butterfly. His fingers traced the words. The butterfly, the necklace. Emily still had it. After all these years, she still wore it. And that meant something. It meant she had never truly been lost. Something deep inside her had held onto that piece of her past, even when everything else had been erased. And if there was even the smallest chance that he could bring her memories back, he had to try. The next morning, Thomas made his way to the only place he knew he could start, St. Joseph's Church. The building looked different in the daylight, less ominous, more ordinary. But Thomas knew better. He knew that behind those stone walls, secrets had been buried. And one of them had tried to warn him, the priest. Thomas stepped inside, the air cool and quiet. The scent of old wood and candle wax lingered as he walked down the aisle, searching for the man who had given him the first real piece of the puzzle. But something was wrong. The church was empty. Too empty. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest as he made his way toward the back, where the priest's office had been. The door was slightly ajar. Thomas hesitated. Then, heart-pounding, he stepped inside. The room was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the desk, books overturned, as if someone had been looking for something, or trying to hide something. Thomas's stomach twisted as he took another step forward. The chair was empty. The desk was empty. The entire room felt abandoned. And then his eyes landed on a single sheet of paper, left in the center of the desk. A note. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. They know you're looking. Be careful. Follow the butterfly. Thomas's breath caught. The priest had known. And now he was gone. Thomas clenched the note in his fist. He was running out of time. That night, Thomas stood outside the house again. The lights were still on. The black car was still in the driveway. And somewhere inside, Elizabeth was still being kept from the truth. His heart pounded as he watched the windows, waiting, hoping for a glimpse of her. And then, finally, he saw it. A shadow moving upstairs. A figure stepping onto the small balcony overlooking the garden. Elizabeth. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out into the night. Thomas inhaled sharply. This was his chance. Moving quickly, he made his way around the garden, keeping to the shadows until he was directly beneath the balcony. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the old silver necklace he had carried with him for 30 years, the twin to the one she wore. Holding his breath, he reached up and tossed it onto the balcony. It landed with a soft clink at her feet. Elizabeth gasped, stepping back. Then, slowly, she bent down. Picking it up, Thomas watched, his heart hammering. For a long moment, she just stood there, turning the necklace over in her hands. And then, she looked down. Her eyes met his. Something shifted in her expression. A crack, a flicker. And then, to his astonishment, she whispered a single word. A name. Dad. Thomas's entire world shattered. For the first time in 30 years, she had remembered. It was only a whisper, only a fragment of a memory. But it was enough. She knew. She knew. Tears blurred his vision as he opened his mouth to speak. But before he could say a word, the door behind her burst open. The man in the suit. Elizabeth gasped, shoving the necklace into her pocket as the man stepped onto the balcony. His expression dark. Get inside, he ordered. She hesitated. For the first time, she hesitated. And Thomas saw it. The way her fingers clutched the butterfly charm. the way her lips trembled, the way she fought against whatever hold they had over her. She was waking up. The man in the suit stepped closer, lowering his voice. Elizabeth. She flinched at the name. Thomas's breath caught. She flinched. The man's eyes flickered downward, toward the necklace she had tried to hide. And then, slowly, dangerously, he turned his head toward Thomas. Their eyes met, and in that moment Thomas knew. They weren't going to let her go. Not without a fight. And this time he wasn't going to run. This time he was going to win. Thomas didn't breathe. He didn't move. His entire body was frozen in place as his eyes locked onto the man standing beside his daughter, his grip tightening around her arm. Elizabeth, Emily, his child. She was right there, her face pale under the dim glow of the balcony light, her fingers trembling as they clutched the butterfly necklace he had thrown to her just moments before. And then there was the man in the suit, the same man who had stopped him at the church, the same man who had warned him to leave this alone, the same man who now stood between Thomas and the only thing that had ever mattered. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, slowly, the man's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. Persistent, aren't you? His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that was meant to intimidate, to make Thomas feel like a fool for even trying. Thomas clenched his fists at his sides. Let her go. His voice was hoarse, but steady. The man tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. Let who go? He glanced down at Elizabeth, his grip tightening just slightly. Elizabeth, do you know this man? Elizabeth flinched. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting back and forth between Thomas and the man beside her. He could see it now, doubt. She was questioning everything. She was trying to remember, and she was afraid. Thomas took a step forward, ignoring the way his body protested, ignoring the sharp pain in his chest. He had no time for weakness. Not now. Emily, he said softly, forcing every ounce of love, of desperation, of longing into the name. It's me. It's your father. She sucked in a sharp breath. The man in the suit chuckled under his breath. That's enough, he murmured, pulling her back slightly. But Elizabeth didn't move. Her hands curled around the necklace, her lips parting slightly, as if she were about to say something. And then, as if out of nowhere, a sharp gust of wind blew through the garden. The old wind chimes hanging from the balcony railing jingled softly, their delicate notes filling the silence. And just like that, Thomas saw it. The way Elizabeth's entire body tensed. The way her eyes widened, like something deep inside her had cracked open. A memory buried so deep that it had taken 30 years to surface. The chimes. Thomas felt his throat tighten. She remembers. Elizabeth's hand flew to her head, as if the sudden flood of images was too much. She gasped, taking a step back, shaking her head as if trying to fight against whatever was surfacing in her mind. The man in the suit stiffened. Elizabeth, he said sharply. She didn't answer. She didn't even seem to hear him. Her breath was coming faster now, her fingers gripping the necklace so tightly that her knuckles turned white. And then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. I know that sound, she murmured, her voice shaky. The man in the suit went still. Thomas felt his heart slam against his ribs. Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling. I've heard it before. A long time ago. Her fingers brushed over the butterfly pendant. Thomas took a step closer, his voice barely audible. Yes, he whispered. You have. The man in the suit's jaw tightened. He knew. He knew what was happening. Elizabeth looked up at Thomas, her lips trembling. Why do I remember? Tears burned at the back of Thomas's eyes. Because it's real, he choked out. Because you are real. You're not Elizabeth. You never were. Her breath hitched. You're Emily, he said, his voice breaking. My Emily. For a second, everything was still. And then, enough. The man in the suit's voice was cold, sharp, final. Thomas barely had time to react before the man grabbed Elizabeth's wrist and yanked her inside. No! Thomas surged forward, his hands slamming against the metal railing of the balcony. "Let her go!" Elizabeth's eyes widened in panic as she stumbled backward into the house. "Wait!" The balcony doors slammed shut. Thomas pounded his fists against the glass. "Emily!" She was reaching for him. He could see it. Her hand pressed against the window, her eyes desperate, filled with something he had almost lost hope of ever seeing. Recognition. And then, the curtains were drawn. His daughter disappeared from sight, and Thomas was left standing alone in the darkness, his entire body trembling, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Thomas didn't know how long he stood there. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. At some point, he found himself back at his apartment, his hands gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He had failed. Again. He had almost gotten through to her. He had almost made her remember. And then, just like before, they had taken her away. A sob tore from his throat as he slammed his fist against the counter. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not when he was so close. His eyes flickered to the journal sitting on the table behind him. Follow the butterfly. His heart pounded. The butterfly necklace. It had been the key all along. It was the one thing they hadn't been able to take from her, which meant it was the one thing that could bring her back. His grip tightened. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the journal, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A name, place, the last clue Claire had left for him. And with his heart racing, his mind sharp with determination, he knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And this time, he was going to finish it. Thomas Carter had always believed there were two kinds of pain in life, the kind that faded with time and the kind that never truly left. The latter was what he carried now, heavy and unrelenting, pressing against his chest like an iron weight. He had come so close, so close. He had seen the flicker of recognition in Emily's eyes. He had heard the tremble in her voice. For a single, fleeting moment, she had remembered. And then she was gone again, taken, erased, again. Thomas sat in his small, cluttered apartment, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Claire's journal lay open on the table before him, its worn pages filled with desperate handwriting, scrawled notes, and hidden warnings. His hands trembled as he traced the last words she had written. Follow the butterfly. The butterfly necklace had been the key. And now, it was the only thing keeping Emily tethered to a past that had been stolen from her. His eyes flickered to the window, where the city lights pulsed in the distance, a constant reminder that life went on, heedless, indifferent, while he sat here, trapped in a moment that had never ended. 30 years of searching, 30 years of grief, 30 years of loss, but not anymore. His fingers curled into fists. If they thought they could take her away again, they were wrong. He wasn't going to let them win. The morning air was crisp, the autumn wind carrying the scent of damp earth and fading leaves as Thomas stood outside the house once more. The mansion loomed before him, its tall iron gates locked, its pristine windows reflecting the gray sky. She was in there, somewhere beyond those walls, and he wasn't leaving without her. Thomas clenched his jaw, his heart pounding as he scanned the perimeter. The security was tight, too tight. Cameras were positioned at every corner, the high walls reinforced with thick ivy that had been carefully trimmed, preventing any easy way in. They were expecting him. Of course they were. After last night, after the way Emily, had reacted, after the way she had remembered, there was no way they would risk another encounter. Thomas took a slow breath, steadying himself. He needed another way inside. He turned, his gaze sweeping the property, searching for something, anything, that might give him an opening. And then he saw it. A small, unmarked service entrance at the back of the estate. It was hidden beneath thick overgrowth, almost invisible from a distance. Almost. Thomas's pulse quickened. This was it. His way in. Moving quickly, he made his way toward the entrance, keeping to the shadows, his steps silent against the damp earth. His heart pounded with each movement, every breath measured, every second ticking by like a countdown to something inevitable. He reached the door, tested the handle. Locked, of course. His fingers brushed against the edge of the frame, feeling for anything, any weakness, any imperfection. And then, faint click. The door shifted slightly, not fully locked. Someone had been careless, or maybe someone had left it open on purpose. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before slipping inside. The hallway was dark, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and something faintly metallic. He moved carefully, his breath shallow, his ears straining for any sound. Footsteps, voices, somewhere above him. He kept moving. Every hallway was identical, long, sterile, impersonal. Nothing about this place felt like a home, felt like a prison. Then, a voice, soft, familiar. His chest tightened. Elizabeth. Emily. She was close. He followed the sound, his pulse racing, his hands trembling at his sides. He reached the end of the hall, pausing outside a partially open door. Inside, she sat on the edge of a large, ornate bed, her posture rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. Her head was bowed. She was thinking, remembering. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had to be careful. If he startled her, if he said the wrong thing, if he pushed too hard, he couldn't lose her again. Taking a slow, measured breath, he stepped forward. Emily. Her entire body jerked at the sound of his voice. She turned sharply, her eyes wide, her expression shifting between shock, confusion, and something deeper. Why you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He took another step forward, his heart aching at the sheer fear in her gaze. It's me, he said softly. It's your father. She shook her head, standing so quickly that the chair behind her scraped against the floor. No, she breathed. That's not true. It is, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. You know it is. Her hands flew to her head. I can't. You can, he urged, stepping closer. Emily, listen to me. You're my daughter. You always have been. They took you from me. They made you forget. But you remember, don't you? Her breath hitched. A tear slid down her cheek. I don't know who I am, she whispered. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Yes, you do, he said gently. Her hands clutched the butterfly necklace. She was shaking. And then, just as her lips parted, as if she were about to say something, the door slammed open. The man in the suit. Thomas barely had time to react before strong hands grabbed his arms, yanking him backward. No! He struggled, his heart racing, his mind screaming. Let me go! Elizabeth's eyes filled with panic. Wait! She cried, stepping forward. But the man in the suit simply shook his head. You should have left when you had the chance, Mr. Carter. Thomas's blood ran cold. He fought. He fought with everything he had. But it wasn't enough. He was dragged away, his daughter's face the last thing he saw before the door slammed shut between them. Darkness swallowed him, and for the first time in 30 years Thomas knew they weren't just trying to erase her past. They were trying to erase him, too. He woke up in a dark room. The air was cold. The walls were concrete. A single light flickered above him, casting eerie shadows across the floor. A chair sat in the middle of the room, a chair he was tied to. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't over, not even close. And as the door creaked open, revealing a silhouette standing in the threshold, Thomas lifted his chin, his eyes burning with fire. They had taken everything from him once, but they weren't going to win. Not this time, not ever again. The air was heavy, damp, cold. It clung to Thomas's skin like a second layer, the chill seeping into his bones as he sat, bound to a chair in the middle of the darkened room. His wrists burned where the ropes dug into them. His shoulders ached from the tight grip they had used to restrain him, but none of it mattered. Not the pain, not the cold, not the fear gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Only one thing mattered. Emily, his daughter. She was so close. He had seen it, felt it, The way her hands had trembled around that butterfly necklace, the way her breath had caught in her throat when she heard his voice. She had remembered, if only for a moment, and that was why he was here now. Because they knew. Because whoever had spent the last 30 years keeping her away from him had finally realized the truth. Emily was slipping through their fingers, and they were desperate to keep her. A sound echoed through the room, the sharp, metallic creak of a door opening. Thomas tensed. His breath steadied. He wouldn't break. No matter what they did, no matter what they said, he wouldn't break. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Then a voice. "Mr. Carter." Thomas exhaled sharply through his nose. "I assume you're the one who's been pulling the strings." A low chuckle. "You assume correctly." The figure stepped forward, moving into the faint light above Thomas's head. It was the man in the suit, the one who had been watching him, stalking his every move, ripping Emily away from him every time he got close. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Someone who has been very patient with you." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Patience, huh? That's an interesting word choice for someone who just kidnapped an old man and tied him to a chair." The man's smile didn't waver. "You really don't understand, do you?" Thomas didn't respond. He didn't blink. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing doubt in his eyes. The man sighed, adjusting his cufflinks before pacing in slow, measured steps. "You think you've been searching for your daughter, Mr. Carter, that you've been trying to bring her back." Thomas's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. "You believe she's trapped, that someone has taken her from you, that she's been living a lie." The man tilted his head slightly. "But tell me, what if it's you who's been living in a lie?" A sharp chill crawled up Thomas's spine, but he gritted his teeth. "I don't have time for your mind games." The man chuckled. "No? That's unfortunate, because time is all you have left." Thomas's fingers curled against the ropes. "Where is she?" The man didn't answer right away. He studied Thomas for a long moment, as if measuring him, testing him. Then, finally, he said, "She's safe." A flare of anger surged through Thomas. "Safe?" His voice was low, raw. "You call this safe? You've kept her locked in a life that isn't hers. You've lied to her, erased her past. You took everything from her." The man's expression remained calm. "And yet, she has lived a good life. She is healthy, protected, unburdened by the tragedies of her past." He leaned slightly closer. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, if you could erase the worst day of your life, wouldn't you?" Thomas's breath caught. The worst day of his life. The day Emily and Claire had vanished. The day his world had ended. The man's voice was softer now, almost coaxing. "Do you think she wants to remember? Do you think she needs to?" Thomas clenched his jaw. "It's not your decision to make." The man sighed, stepping back. "You're a stubborn man." Thomas's eyes burned. "And you're a coward." For the first time, something flickered across the man's face. Not anger, not amusement, something else. Regret. But it was gone just as quickly. The man straightened his tie. "This ends tonight, Mr. Carter." Thomas's pulse spiked. The man continued, his voice cool and measured. "You will leave. You will forget about Elizabeth. You will walk away and never look back." Thomas let out a breathless laugh. "And if I don't?" The man's eyes darkened. "Then she will." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Thomas's chest tightened. "They will erase you, Mr. Carter. Completely." The man's voice was eerily calm. "She will not remember you. Not your face. Not your voice. Not your name." He paused. "Not even the idea of you." Thomas felt his pulse hammering against his skull. "They did it once," the man murmured. "They can do it again." A cold wave of realization washed over him. That was why she didn't remember. It wasn't just time. It wasn't just distance. They had taken her, and then they had erased him. A hollow ache spread through his chest. How much of Emily was still hers? How much had they stolen from her? And if he failed now, would there be anything left of her at all? The man exhaled, checking his watch. "You have until morning." Thomas's blood ran cold. "If you are still here by sunrise," the man continued, "she will forget you forever." Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs. The man turned toward the door. "Think carefully, Mr. Carter. You can lose her one last time, or you can let her go." The door opened, and just before the man stepped out, he murmured, "The choice is yours." The door shut, and Thomas was alone. Alone with the silence. Alone with the truth. Alone with the crushing weight of an impossible choice. He had fought for so long, but now they were forcing him to ask himself a question he had never once considered. Was saving her worth the risk of losing her forever? His breath shuddered. His vision blurred. And for the first time in 30 years, Thomas didn't know what to do. The silence was unbearable. It wrapped around Thomas like a suffocating weight, pressing into his chest, crushing his ribs, making it hard to breathe. He sat in the chair, still bound, still trapped, his mind racing with the man's final words. The choice is yours. Was it? Was it really? They had given him an ultimatum. Leave by morning or lose her forever. It was an impossible choice. A cruel, twisted game. If he left, they would let her live her life. Safe, untouched, unaware. But she would never remember him. If he stayed, they would erase him from her mind completely. Thomas clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. How could he make that choice? How could he just walk away? His heart ached at the thought. He had searched for so long, fought for so long. He had held on to nothing but hope for 3 decades. And now they were asking him to let go. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, there had to be another way. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not after everything. His gaze flickered around the room, his mind sharpening. He couldn't sit here. He couldn't just wait. He had to move. He had to act. He tested the ropes around his wrists, twisting his hands just enough to feel the fibers strain. The knots were tight, too tight, but they weren't impossible. Slowly, methodically, he worked his wrists against the restraints, ignoring the sting of raw skin scraping against the coarse rope. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath shallow. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, and then, a sharp snap, his right wrist came loose. Thomas's heart leaped into his throat. Careful, slow. He worked the other wrist free, his hands tingling as blood rushed back into them. He didn't stop. He moved to the ropes binding his ankles, his fingers fumbling slightly in the dim light. Another snap. He was free. He stood slowly, his muscles stiff, his body sore from being held in place for too long. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to focus. He had to get out of here. He had to find her. Moving cautiously, he approached the door, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. He tested the handle. Locked, of course. His gaze swept the room, searching for something, anything that could help. And then he saw it. A small, rusted metal pipe lying in the corner. His pulse quickened. He grabbed it, weighing it in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Taking a deep breath, he positioned himself against the door and swung. The first hit sent a dull echo through the room. The second cracked the wood. The third, the door burst open. Thomas didn't wait. He moved, fast. The hallway was empty, dimly lit, cold. He didn't know where he was. Some kind of underground facility? A basement? It didn't matter. He had one goal: find Emily. He moved through the hallways with measured steps, his ears straining for any sound, his body tensed for any sign of movement. Then he heard it. A voice, muffled, soft. Emily. His breath caught. He followed the sound, his heart pounding harder with every step. The hallway opened into a dimly lit room, and there, standing near a large bookshelf, was her. Emily. She was alone. Her back was to him, her hands gripping the edges of a small table, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Thomas's throat tightened. Emily, he whispered. She froze. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, something in her face shifted. A flicker of recognition, a shadow of a memory. Her lips parted. "Dad." Thomas's breath shuddered out of him. She remembered. At least part of her did. He stepped forward. "It's me, sweetheart. It's me." Her eyes filled with tears. She started, her voice breaking. I don't understand. I keep seeing things, hearing things. I don't know what's real anymore." Thomas swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached out to her. "You are real, Emily. This life they've built around you, it's not. They took you from me. They made you forget. But you remember, don't you? Deep down, you know the truth." She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying to her head. She gasped. "I remember a woman, a voice. She was singing." Thomas's breath hitched. "Claire. It had to be Claire." His hands tightened into fists. "Emily, listen to me. You were never Elizabeth. You had a mother, a family. You had a life before they took it from you." She opened her eyes, her expression raw, desperate. "Then why does it feel like I'm drowning?" Thomas took another step closer. "Because they filled your mind with lies. Because they erased you." She shook her head wildly. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this." Her voice cracked. "I just want to remember." Thomas reached for her, and just as she stepped forward, a voice cut through the air. "That's enough." The man in the suit. Emily gasped, spinning around. Thomas's blood turned to ice. The man stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Behind him, several others loomed in the shadows. Trapped, Thomas clenched his jaw. "You just don't know when to stop, do you, Mr. Carter?" The man sighed. "I told you. You had a choice." Emily's hands trembled. What is this?" She looked between them, her breath ragged. Thomas's chest ached. They had pushed her too far, too fast. She wasn't ready. The man in the suit stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Emily's. "Come with me." Emily flinched. The man's voice softened. "Elizabeth." She hesitated for just a second. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "My name isn't Elizabeth." Thomas's heart pounded. The man's expression darkened. "That's unfortunate." And then, something in Emily's face changed. Her breath hitched. Her eyes widened. Her hands flew to her head as a sharp, gasping sob tore from her throat. More memories, more truths flooding back in. Thomas reached for her. "Emily!" She stumbled. She collapsed. Thomas caught her just as her body went limp. The man in the suit watched, his expression unreadable. And then, he sighed. "It's too late now." Thomas's stomach dropped. The room spun, and as Emily's body trembled in his arms, her fingers clutching at the butterfly necklace, her eyes fluttering open with a new, terrifying awareness. Thomas knew. The real truth was just beginning to surface, and it was worse than anything he had imagined. Emily's body was shaking. Thomas could feel it beneath his hands, the tremors rattling through her as if something inside her was breaking apart. She clung to his shirt, her breaths ragged, uneven, each one punctuated by a choked sob. He held her tightly, cradling her against him, his fingers running through her hair as he whispered her name over and over again. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. I've got you." But she wasn't okay. She was gasping now, her fingers twitching, her head jerking slightly as if she were fighting something. Something unseen, something buried too deep for her to reach on her own. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, she went still. Thomas froze. Her breathing slowed. Her grip on him loosened. And then, she lifted her head, and the look in her eyes made his blood turn to ice. It was fear. Not the kind of fear that came from confusion or uncertainty. No, it was the kind of fear that came from remembering something that was never meant to be remembered. Her lips trembled, and then she whispered, "It wasn't an accident." Thomas's heart stopped. His grip tightened on her arms. "What?" She shook her head, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. Someone. That day, the roller coaster, the accident. It wasn't an accident. Thomas's stomach twisted. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her she must be confused, that she had been a child, that she couldn't possibly. But then she looked at him, and he saw it. The truth, clear, undeniable, cold. A sharp, slicing pain ran through his chest. "Emily," he whispered. Her voice was shaking. "Someone took me, Dad. Someone took me." Thomas's breath hitched. The roller coaster had never malfunctioned. The tragedy that had taken his daughter and wife from him, it hadn't been a tragedy at all. It had been planned. His entire body went numb. His thoughts spun in wild, chaotic circles, his mind racing through the past, searching desperately for anything. Any sign, any hint that he had missed. And then, just as quickly, another thought slammed into him. Claire, his wife. Had she known? Had she fought? Had she tried to stop it? And was that why she had disappeared, too? A deep, violent rage curled in his stomach. He had been mourning them all these years. But now he had to ask himself a new question. Had Claire ever really been dead? Or had they taken her, too? His blood ran cold. He turned to Emily, gripping her shoulders. "Do you remember who took you?" Her breathing was uneven. She pressed a hand against her temple, her fingers gripping her head as if trying to hold herself together. I don't know. She shook her head wildly. "It was dark. I remember voices. I remember her." Thomas stiffened. "Her?" Emily squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She was crying. She was screaming my name. And then, she inhaled sharply. "And then they made me forget." Thomas felt his entire body go rigid. Claire. She had been there. She had seen. And whoever had taken Emily had taken Claire, too. But if she wasn't dead, then where was she? The realization hit him with the force of a train. If they had erased Emily's past, if they had stripped her of everything that made her herself, then what had they done to Claire? His fists clenched at his sides. He turned sharply to the man in the suit. "You knew." His voice was low, dark, filled with barely contained fury. "You knew this wasn't an accident. You knew they took her. You knew all of it." The man sighed. "And yet, here we are." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Where is she?" The man didn't answer. Thomas took a step forward, his voice rising. "Where is my wife?" Emily flinched. The man exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Mr. Carter, you need to understand." "No." Thomas's voice was sharp. "No more games. No more lies. You took my daughter from me. You erased her life. And now..." His eyes burned. "Now you expect me to believe my wife is gone?" The man's expression remained unreadable. And then, after a long, heavy silence, he said, "She's alive." The words slammed into Thomas like a punch to the gut. His breath caught. His body swayed slightly. He felt Emily tense beside him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Alive. Claire was alive. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. "Where is she?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Would you like to find out?" Thomas's stomach twisted. He knew a trap when he heard one, but he didn't care. He would walk straight into hell if it meant finding Claire. He inhaled sharply. "Take me to her." The man in the suit studied him for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Very well," he murmured. And Thomas knew. Everything was about to change. Everything he thought he knew was about to be shattered. And by the time the sun rose, the truth, the real truth, would finally be revealed. Thomas Carter felt the weight of 30 years pressing against his chest as he sat in the back seat of the sleek black car, his hands gripping the worn edges of Claire's journal. The city blurred past the window, but he barely saw it. His mind was racing, his body tense, his heart hammering with a mixture of fear and something he hadn't dared to feel in decades. Hope. Claire was alive. The words echoed in his skull, rattling inside him like a truth too big to hold. They had taken Emily. They had erased her. But Claire, had they done the same to her? Had she spent the last 30 years trapped in the same lie as their daughter? Had she fought? Had she remembered? Had she searched for him the way he had searched for her? A sharp ache formed in his throat. He had to know. The car slowed as they entered a secluded part of the city, the buildings thinning out, replaced by trees and open land. The road wound upward, leading to a massive estate perched on the edge of a hill, its high iron gates looming in the darkness. Thomas's breath hitched. This place, it wasn't a prison. It was a home. The realization sent a cold wave of unease through him. He turned to the man in the suit, his jaw tight. "Where is she?" The man simply nodded toward the house. Inside. Thomas didn't wait. He shoved the car door open before it had even fully stopped, his legs stiff as he stumbled forward, his body barely keeping up with the storm inside his chest. Emily followed. She hadn't spoken since they had left the underground facility. She was still processing, still unraveling the shattered pieces of a life that had been stolen from her. But she was here. She was beside him, and he would never let her go again. The front door loomed ahead, massive and intimidating. Thomas reached for the handle. It wasn't locked. The door creaked open. The house was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled of old books and fresh flowers. The floors gleamed under the dim glow of chandelier light. A staircase curved upward, disappearing into the shadows of the second floor. And then, a voice, soft, familiar. "Thomas." The sound hit him like a bullet to the chest. His breath shuddered out of him. His knees nearly buckled. He turned, and there, standing at the top of the stairs, was Claire, his wife, the mother of his child, the woman he had lost, the woman he had mourned, alive, real, whole. Thomas's world tilted. He couldn't breathe. She hadn't changed. Her hair was streaked with silver now, her face lined with faint traces of time. But her eyes, God, her eyes, they were the same warmth, the same depth, the same love. "Claire." His voice cracked. She covered her mouth with her hands, a strangled sob escaping her lips. "Oh my God." And then she was running, down the stairs, across the floor, into his arms. The moment she collided with him, the years dissolved. The decades of loss, the grief, the unanswered questions. None of it mattered. Only this, only her. He held her so tightly he thought they might fuse together, his arms trembling around her, his heart hammering against hers. "Tell me I'm not dreaming," he rasped into her hair. "Tell me you're real." She pulled back just enough to cup his face in her hands, her fingers shaking. "It's real," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm here. You're here." Emily stood frozen a few feet away, her hands pressed to her chest, her breath shallow. Claire turned to her, and then, recognition. Not the slow, creeping kind that had haunted Emily for days. No, this was instant. A mother seeing her daughter for the first time in 30 years. A daughter looking into the eyes of a woman she had loved without knowing why. Emily let out a choked sob, and then she ran. Claire caught her. The embrace shattered something inside Thomas. He watched, helpless, as Emily clung to Claire, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in gasps as memories crashed over her. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. Claire pressed her lips against Emily's hair, rocking her gently, whispering words only a mother could offer. Thomas wiped his face with the back of his hand, his own breath uneven. He had his family. He had them both. But the question still loomed. How had this happened? And why had Claire been hidden from him for so long? He turned to the man in the suit. "Talk." The man exhaled slowly. "You weren't supposed to find them," he admitted. "Neither of them." Thomas's fists clenched. "Why? Why?" The man looked at Claire, and she lowered her gaze. Thomas's stomach dropped. "Claire," he whispered. She inhaled sharply, and then she said the words that broke him. "I was the one who made the deal, Thomas." Silence. Thick, suffocating. Thomas took a step back. "What are you talking about?" Claire swallowed hard, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "I made a deal to keep Emily safe." His pulse roared. "Safe from what?" She squeezed her eyes shut. Then, barely above a whisper, "From you." The world stopped. A sharp, Slicing pain spread through Thomas's chest. He felt his body sway, his breath shatter. "What?" Claire sobbed. "I didn't know what else to do, Thomas. You weren't supposed to remember her." His hands shook. "What are you saying?" She let out a shaky breath. "They didn't erase Emily from your life." Her lips trembled. "They erased you from hers." The room spun. The air vanished. Thomas's knees nearly gave out. And in that moment, as the truth settled like ice in his veins, he realized he wasn't the one who had been searching. She had been the one lost, and they had made sure she never came back. Until now, the past had finally caught up to them, and this time there was no turning back.